Judas Iscariot, a name that echoes through the corridors of history like a curse. For 2,000 years, he has been known as the ultimate traitor, the disciple who sold Jesus for 30 silver coins, the man who delivered the Messiah into the hands of death. Artists painted his shame, preachers condemned his soul, and believers around the world reviled his name. But what if we've misunderstood everything? What if Judas wasn't a villain, but a chosen instrument? What if he was not the one who betrayed Jesus, but the only one who truly understood him? Buried beneath centuries of doctrine and dogma lies a forgotten manuscript, a gospel so explosive, so threatening to the official story, that it was buried and lost for nearly 1,800 years. This is the Gospel of Judas, a text that rewrites the most critical moment in Christian history. In the mid-1970s, a group of looters stumbled upon a decaying codex in a remote cave in Egypt. They had no idea what they were holding. It passed through smugglers and collectors, hidden in bank vaults and nearly disintegrated due to neglect. For decades, it sat in darkness, until, finally, scholars began to restore it. What they uncovered shook the foundations of religious thought. This gospel did not portray Judas as the betrayer. Instead, it presented him as the one disciple chosen by Jesus for a sacred mission. The Gospel of Judas reveals a secret, that Jesus wanted Judas to hand him over. That in doing so, Judas was not condemning him, but freeing him. According to this mysterious text, Jesus says to Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me." In Gnostic belief, which this gospel echoes, the physical body is a prison. Salvation comes through release from the material world. Jesus wasn't dying for sin. He was escaping the false reality of flesh. And Judas was the only one who understood. This was not the only gospel that challenged the mainstream. In the early centuries after Jesus' death, there were many gospels, circulating at dozens, perhaps hundreds. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, each offered a different window into the message and mystery of Jesus. And among them were the Gnostic texts, writings that offered a radically different view of reality. To the Gnostics, the physical world was not the creation of a benevolent God, but the work of a lower, flawed entity, a demiurge. They believed the true divine realm was spiritual, and that within each person was a divine spark trapped in flesh. Jesus came not to die for sin, but to awaken people to this truth, to help them remember who they truly were. In this context, the Gospel of Judas makes sense. Jesus laughs at the other disciples for worshiping the false god. He calls them foolish for clinging to the physical world. But to Judas, he reveals the secret. Judas alone sees the truth. Judas alone is willing to take on the burden of being hated, misunderstood, and condemned to do what no one else could. This revelation was dangerous. As Christianity became more structured, more organized, and more political, it needed a unified doctrine. The bishops of the early church, especially in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, began to select which gospels would be considered true and which would be heretical. The Gnostic writings were declared false, dangerous, even demonic. They were banned, burned, and buried. The Gospel of Judas disappeared until it was found again. The manuscript, known as the Codex Chakos, was badly damaged. Written in Coptic, it took years of careful restoration and translation. But when the meaning became clear, the world took notice. Here was a gospel that told us the greatest villain in the story may have been the only true believer. It's easy to understand why this would threaten the early church. If Judas was not a traitor, but a participant in a divine plan, what does that mean for the concept of sin? For salvation? For the authority of the church? More importantly, Who decided which version of the story was true? Was it divine inspiration or human power? These are the questions that rise when you read the Gospel of Judas. Questions that shake centuries of tradition. This text does not ask for belief. It demands awakening. And yet, for all its shocking claims, the Gospel is quiet, mysterious, full of symbols and visions. Jesus speaks not in sermons, but in riddles. He takes Judas aside, away from the other disciples, and shows him the truth of the cosmos. He reveals heavenly realms, angelic beings, and the hidden architecture of the universe. Judas sees more than the others. He understands more than the others. And it is for this reason, because he knows that he must do what no one else can, to give Jesus over, so that Jesus can be set free. To the modern mind, this idea is almost incomprehensible. We are taught that betrayal is evil, that Judas was damned, that his kiss was the darkest moment in history. But in this gospel, the kiss is an act of courage, a sacred gesture, a necessary step in a greater plan. And Judas? He becomes not a figure of shame, but a symbol of tragic obedience. But who wrote this gospel? And why was it so different from the others? Scholars believe the Gospel of Judas was written sometime in the 2nd century CE, likely by a group of Gnostic Christians. Unlike the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this one was not written to tell a public story of Jesus' life. It was meant for a select few, those with the eyes to see, those who sought truth beyond the surface. In its pages, Jesus doesn't focus on miracles or parables. Instead, he speaks in riddles about the spirit world, about aeons and eternal realms, about hidden truths beyond human comprehension. He calls the God worshipped by most people a false god, a blind and arrogant creator who made the material world out of ignorance. This is not the Jesus of Sunday school. This is a Jesus who laughs, not out of joy, but out of knowing. He laughs at the ignorance of those who pray without understanding, who worship the body instead of the spirit, who follow the rules without seeking the truth. In this gospel, the 12 disciples are depicted as being lost. They speak of sacrifices and altars, of laws and rituals still clinging to old traditions. But Jesus tells them they have not seen the true God. They do not know where they come from. Only Judas dares to ask the deeper questions. Only Judas sees beyond the veil. Jesus tells him, "You will grieve greatly when you see the kingdom and all its generation." He is warning Judas that to carry this truth, to follow this path, is to suffer, to be misunderstood, to be hated, and yet he is the only one entrusted with the secret. In this cosmic vision, Jesus shows Judas the truth of creation, that the human body is a shell, a prison, that within it lies a spark of the divine, and that spark must be awakened and set free, not through death as punishment, but death as liberation. The material world, according to this gospel, was created by lesser divine beings, not the ultimate God. These beings, called archons, built a false reality. They rule through ignorance and illusion. But Jesus comes from beyond them, from the realm of pure light. He comes to remind souls of their true origin. But not everyone can handle this truth. The other disciples turn against Judas. Jesus tells him, "You will be cursed by the other generations." And so it was. Judas became the scapegoat of Christianity, the symbol of betrayal. His name reviled in every language. But if this gospel is right, then Judas was not a betrayer. He was the only one who obeyed. He sacrificed his reputation, his legacy, and perhaps his own soul, all for the sake of Jesus' plan. But then why didn't this version of events survive in mainstream Christianity? The answer lies not in truth, but in power. As the Christian church began to grow, it needed control. Control over doctrine, control over texts, control over belief. There were too many versions of Jesus, too many gospels, too many interpretations. So church leaders began to decide what was orthodox and what was heretical. The Gospel of Judas, with its radical message, was too dangerous. It undermined the very idea of Jesus' death as a payment for sin. It questioned the God of the Old Testament. It cast doubt on the authority of the apostles, and it presented Judas, the most hated figure in Christian history, as the chosen one. It had to be silenced. So it was condemned. And like many other Gnostic texts, it vanished from history, until fate or something more brought it back. The codex that contained the Gospel of Judas also included other texts, strange, mystical writings like the letter of Peter to Philip and a text called James. These were not the teachings of a church concerned with laws and obedience. They were the words of mystics, seekers, wanderers of the inner world, and the Gospel of Judas stood out among them. It was not long, only about 13 pages in the Coptic manuscript, but those 13 pages were enough to unsettle centuries of theology. When the translation was released to the public in 2006, the reaction was intense. Some scholars hailed it as a revolutionary discovery. Others dismissed it as a Gnostic fantasy. Religious leaders warned that it was misleading, even dangerous. But beyond all the debate, one thing was clear. The Gospel of Judas forced the IEOs at World to ask questions. What if the story we were told is not the only story? What if there were other voices, other visions, other gospels, buried not because they were false, but because they were too true? What if betrayal and loyalty are not as simple as they seem? And most haunting of all, what if Judas did exactly what Jesus asked? That question lingers like a whisper in the shadows of history. A truth hidden in plain sight. A gospel buried not just in the desert sands, but beneath layers of silence, fear, and forgotten wisdom. And now, it speaks again. But to truly understand the Gospel of Judas, we must look deeper into its symbolic language, into the visions and dialogues that form its beating heart. The Gospel is not structured like a narrative. There is no linear storytelling, no birth in Bethlehem, no crucifixion on Golgotha. It is a conversation, a whisper in the dark. A meeting between two souls on the edge of eternity. Jesus tells Judas, "Step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom." And so begins a revelation unlike anything in the canonical Gospels. Jesus describes aeons, timeless beings, emanations of divine reality. He speaks of a luminous cloud, of realms and angels, of spiritual hierarchies too vast for the human mind to grasp. He reveals that humanity is trapped in cycles of ignorance, born into bodies that blind them, ruled by lesser powers. The God that most people worship, Jesus explains, is not the true Father, but a lower being who believes himself supreme. This being, the demiurge, created the physical world, a place of suffering, death, and illusion. The Gospel of Judas calls him Saklas, which means fool. This is the Gnostic vision, that true salvation does not come from obedience or ritual, but from knowledge, gnosis, of who you really are and where you truly come from. And Judas, he understands. In the Gospel's most haunting passage, Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." This line has perplexed scholars, but its meaning becomes clearer through the Gnostic lens. The man that clothes me is the physical body. Judas is not sending Jesus to death. He is liberating the divine being trapped within flesh. In a profound reversal, the so-called act of betrayal becomes the final step in Jesus' spiritual ascent. Judas is not an enemy. He is an initiate. But this knowledge comes at a price. Jesus warns Judas that his name will be cursed for generations, that others will never understand, that he will become the symbol of treachery, not because he failed, but because he succeeded. It is the most tragic twist in religious history, and it begs a deeper question. What kind of world punishes the truth-bearer? Why would the church suppress this gospel? Why would the figure of Judas be twisted into a villain? Because power needs villains. Institutions need clear lines. Good and evil, sacred and sinful, loyal and traitor. Ambiguity is dangerous. Nuance threatens the system. And the Gospel of Judas is pure ambiguity. It asks us to question everything, not just Judas, but the very structure of the cosmos, the nature of God, and the meaning of salvation. It does not offer easy answers. It invites us into mystery. In one vision, Judas sees a great house with many rooms. He asks Jesus who belongs there. Jesus replies that it is not for mortals, that no one from this generation will enter it. This is not the promise of heaven for the obedient. This is the hidden kingdom of awakened souls, those who have pierced the veil of illusion. In another passage, Jesus shows Judas the generations of angels and stars that rule the cosmos, not as divine guides, but as jailers of the soul. He tells Judas that one day, even these rulers will be destroyed, and a new realm will rise, the realm of the great invisible spirit. It is a vision of cosmic revolution, not just the redemption of man, but the overthrow of false gods. And Judas? He is the first to see it, the first to believe, and yet in the end he is left alone. In the final lines of the Gospel, Judas is said to receive some money and hand Jesus over. The text cuts off, damaged by time. But even in its broken form, the message is clear. He did what he was asked to do. He fulfilled the terrible mission, and the world has hated him for it ever since. But now, centuries later, the truth is rising. Again. The Gospel of Judas reminds us that history is written by the powerful, that what we believe may not always be what is true, that buried beneath every sacred story is another, stranger, deeper, and often far more dangerous. It is not just a gospel, it is a mirror. It forces us to look inward, to ask who we've condemned and why. To ask whether faith is about obedience or understanding, whether salvation is about following rules or waking up. And in that mirror, we may find Judas staring back, not with hatred, but with sorrow. Centuries have passed since Judas Iscariot was damned in every church, his name spat from the pulpit, his legacy reduced to a single act of betrayal. The kiss in the garden, the silver coins, the noose. But now, the sands of Egypt have spoken. From the silence of the desert emerged a gospel that shattered our assumptions, questioned our traditions, and brought forth a voice long buried. Not a villain's voice, but a seeker's. And now we must ask, what if Judas was never the traitor? What if Judas was the only one who truly understood? In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus is not a tragic victim. He is a luminous being from a higher realm, sent to awaken those who are ready. His crucifixion is not a defeat. It is a release, the shedding of his earthly shell. And Judas? He is the catalyst, the one chosen not for his weakness, but for his courage. He accepts the role no one else could. He carries the weight of the world's hatred, knowing that history would never understand. It's a profound act of obedience, not betrayal. But why was this truth hidden? Because power fears complexity. Institutions thrive on certainty. And the story of Judas, as told in this gospel, is far too dangerous for a faith built on rigid lines of good and evil. If Judas was the chosen one, then who else have we misjudged? If Jesus never asked for worship, but for understanding, what does that say about everything we've been taught? The Gospel of Judas doesn't just rewrite history, it rewires the soul. It calls out to the seekers, those who feel something is missing, who sense that the truth cannot be contained in a single book, a single sermon, or a single version of events. It reminds us that light is often hidden in darkness, that those condemned by the world may be closer to heaven than we imagine, and perhaps that is the real threat. Judas reminds us of something uncomfortable, that truth and treachery are sometimes indistinguishable, that obedience to divine will may not look like blind faith, but like rebellion, that the real enemy may not be the one who challenges the system, but the system itself. Today, the Gospel of Judas forces us to confront the shadows of our own beliefs, not just religiously, but personally. How many times have we judged someone based on appearances? How often have we repeated stories without questioning their source? How quickly do we cling to heroes and condemn those who don't fit the mold? The rediscovery of this gospel is not just a historical event, it's a spiritual mirror. And when you look into it, who do you see? Do you see a traitor, or do you see a man who walked alone, misunderstood by the world, carrying a burden no one else would? Maybe, deep down, we are all Judas, torn between duty and doubt, truth and fear, love and loss, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to forgive him, to forgive ourselves, to listen not to the noise of the world, but to the whispers of forgotten wisdom, because sometimes the most sacred truths are the ones they tried hardest to erase. If this story shook something inside you, don't let the silence swallow it again. Subscribe to the channel because more secrets of the past are waiting to be uncovered. Hit like if this video gave you chills, opened your mind, or made you question what you thought you knew.